Good evening. Welcome to the Neenah Historical Society's last program for this program season. We've had a really great year, a lot of wonderful programs, and I really want to just give a special thank you to Nick Jevne. He's the president of Menasha Historical Society, and he's been video recording our programs since January, so really thrilled about that. So we'll have them recorded. You can check them out. If you missed one, we'll be able to, eventually we'll put them on our website, so we'll be able to watch them there as well. I wanted to just give a couple of announcements before we get started. Making a Hometown, Life in Neenah's Progressive Era is our upcoming exhibit. We've been working super hard on it. I think that's why I'm a little bit distracted and fuzzy tonight. We've just been working really long hours trying to get that put together. Had so much help from Dave and Joelle and Walling and so many other volunteers in getting it together. So thank you so much for your help on that. We'll be opening, the members' reception is May 5th, so please join us for that. Friday evening, May 5th, starting at 7. Otherwise, it will be open every Sunday afternoon, starting on the 7th of May, and that will be from noon to 4 every Sunday afternoon. I think you'll really enjoy the exhibit. It's a very interesting look at the relationship between industry and community building organizations and how they work together during the Progressive Era to create our wonderful hometown and create what we still benefit from today. There are so many organizations and industries that had their start in the Progressive Era here in Neenah, and we're still reaping the benefits of that today. The final announcement I have is for our annual meeting that will be held May 11th. We have some sign-up forms on the table over there. If you're interested in attending our annual meeting, we encourage you to do so. The topic will be, we have a speaker coming from University of Wisconsin Extension in Waukesha, and he'll be speaking on the Wisconsin idea, what drives the university system, and that also had its start during the Progressive Era. So great link to our upcoming exhibit. Tonight we'll be hearing from Professor Steve Sheehan. He's on our board. Steve and I worked on the last two exhibits together. He is a history professor at University of Wisconsin-Fox Valley, and he's going to be kind of filling us in on an overview of the Progressive Era and a little bit too about some of the amazing women who were active during Neenah's Progressive Era. So please help me welcome Steve Sheehan.
Hello, thank you. Let me just boot up my pictures here. Well, thank you all very much for coming tonight. As Jane says, I'm Steve Sheehan. I'm an associate professor of history at UW-Fox Valley, and for the last couple of years I've been on the Neenah Historical Society board and really have enjoyed it and have enjoyed getting involved in the community a little bit. Sometimes I feel like a little bit of an imposter though, because I'm an Appletonian. I live in Appleton. But thank you. I know, boo. Thank you for letting me come and talk with you tonight. I'm gonna start out with a quotation from a book, and I don't know if you would be familiar with this book or not, but it's a history of Neenah Menasha, and it's an academic history, and it's mainly about the growth of industry, particularly the paper industry. It's called Factories in the Valley. I don't know if you're familiar with it, if you've read it. Two historians, Charles Glob and Lawrence Larson. It was published in 1969. And I'm going to let you boo me again because they say some bad things about Neenah Menasha. Actually, it's a very good book, and I think it's very even-handed. But there's a part when they're talking about community leadership, and they're largely talking about the people who established the major industries in Neenah and Menasha. What they say is, quote, "For the most part, their philanthropic activities were limited, supporting a church, aiding an occasional worker in distress. Many of their substantial contributions were to charities outside Neenah Menasha. Few members of the leadership seemed to be fundamentally concerned with shaping the character of the community in which they lived. They did not take the lead in promoting the growth and well-being of Neenah and Menasha. So, nasty stuff, right? They shouldn't be saying that. And they're talking about the paper barons, right? And what comes across is that these paper barons and other leading manufacturers kind of complacent and disengaged and not really involved in the community, and well, maybe not. Right? And I think probably a lot of us would argue our grandparents and great-grandparents were engaged. And this is certainly not true for their wives and for their daughters. And so that's what I'm going to talk about tonight, is I'm going to talk about Neenah women during the Progressive era and how they were involved in this movement. Progressive movement was a national social reform movement. I'll talk a little bit more about what made a progressive and what progressive stood for. But it was this national social movement that was trying to build a more harmonious society, get people cooperating and associating with one another. It was a national social movement that was really concerned and focused on health and welfare of the American people, and particularly kind of wellness, health and welfare, and even social justice for working people. And a lot of Neenah women were really engaged in that movement. And so I'm going to stress three themes as I talk tonight. First, it's that women in Neenah were particularly active in these types of organizations that pursued these goals. And it was something that it kind of lent itself to women and the way women were traditionally perceived and what the status of women was at the time. And so this is before the era when middle class and well-to-do women work outside the household for the most part. There are lots of working women, but not in the middle and the upper classes. And the idea of woman at the time is that she's got this family duty, these obligations, it's about service and nurturing. And what Neenah women do, what a lot of progressive women do, is they take that idea and say, yeah, we'll do that. We'll be nurturing wives and mothers, but we'll do it for all of society. We'll start doing that out in the public world. And then what happens is they end up really kind of expanding their own individual lives and experiences and actually working towards women's rights in a lot of ways. So that's one thing that we'll be looking at throughout. And then the other thing is that there's a real emphasis on health and welfare, especially here at the local level in Neenah. That's really important for Neenah's women progressives. And then finally, I want us to keep in mind that what we're looking at here is a local manifestation of a national movement. So this is where Neenah is part of the much broader history of America, and it's a national, even international movement. And it's not just that Neenah women are following along. In certain ways, they're out on the cutting edge of this movement at times, and we'll look at that. I'm going to mainly just look at three organizations, the Women's Tuesday Club, the VNA, and the Women's Christian Temperance Union. We have members of the Tuesday Club here, the current Tuesday Club? Okay, correct me if I'm wrong. So, just very quickly, I want to talk about a general overview of progressivism. If you forgot, if you fell asleep this day in your high school history class, right, I'm going to get you the information you need. Progressivism was, in a lot of ways, it was a response to industrialization. Right, and industrialization had brought these sweeping changes to American society in the 19th century. A lot of them good, right? A lot of them very good. And so better standards of living for people. New products are available, readily available technology to use in the home. On the other hand, industrialization created some problems, some new problems in the United States. Economic inequality, concentrations of poverty in urban areas, social conflict
between the classes. And a lot of these things are new in the industrial age. Americans hadn't really dealt with them in the same way before. And then all of the social problems that tend to go along with economic inequality and concentrations of poverty, so crime and substance abuse and public health problems. And Neenah is a factory town, right? It was a factory town in the late 19th century. I've got the Globe Mill up there. Who the progressives were nationally. They tended to be people actually who were doing pretty well. So middle class people, when I say middle class, I mean it, back at the turn of the 20th century sense of people who, professionals, journalists, ministers, social workers, teachers, these sorts of people, doctors, lawyers. They tend to come from the middle classes of society, so not the wealthy, but also not the very poor. They tend to live in urban areas, in these new factory towns and cities, tend to be well educated, and then nationally a lot of them women. What they believed and what they stood for and what they did in general. So it was a national movement, it was a reform movement, and basically what they were looking to do is to address some of those problems that industrialization had brought about, had caused. So they want to deal with those problems. Very prominent in the state of Wisconsin, I think sometimes when we think progressivism in Wisconsin, we think just politics, right? We think we think Bob La Follette, the La Follette family, we think Madison. But progressivism is also down there at the local level doing direct outreach, not necessarily always just through government and politics. And so as I said before, what progressives really were working towards is a more harmonious, cooperative society, a healthy society. The methods that they used is progressives really wanted to identify and then study and through kind of systematic social scientific research, figure out what problems there were. And so the first step for progressives in reform is always basically identifying and then researching the problem, figuring it out. And then the second step is communicating about it and making people aware of this problem so that we have a broader public awareness of the problem, and then finally developing and implementing some sort of solution. And that could be policy, politics, government kind of stuff. But especially down at the local level in places like Neenah, what that usually meant was direct outreach by citizens, by volunteers, really people trying to change their community. This other picture I have up here, this is kind of one of the iconic photographs of the progressive movement. Do we know who the photographer is? Are we familiar with this photo? This is Jacob Riis. He was a New Yorker, so this is not Neenah, right? This is not Neenah. This is New York City. And I think he illustrates that progressive sensibility of raising awareness and communicating. It comes from a book called How the Other Half Lives, is what it was called. And what it was photographs of the slum areas, inner city, tenement districts of New York. And his idea was that that's the other half, we being the half that doesn't see that, the middle class, and I want to bring that to light. And it's this kind of seminal work in muckraking progressivism where he's exposing people to poverty who don't necessarily get to see it. Photographic technology in this way is fairly new at the time. There aren't a lot of picture books. And so we have this picture here of these three, must be street urchins, right? And they're sleeping, for some reason, in a pile of rubble. When you take a good look at this picture, you kind of realize that it's staged, right? They're not models, and so these were people he would actually encounter, but clearly they're posed. And if you know anything about photography at the time period, especially flash photography, these young men would not have slept through this, right? And honestly, if I were sleeping on the street, I don't think I would choose a pile of rubble. And I don't think any of these kids would have either. So it's closed. On the other hand, it's showing this to the world, and then the idea is we're supposed to feel something, right? What are we supposed to feel when we look at this picture? Horror, outrage, and pity, right? And then we take some kind of action. And so that's very much in keeping with the progressive sensibility. There's a notable progressive. Her name was Alice Hamilton, and she was from Chicago. Well, she did her work in Chicago. And she wrote a memoir about her involvement in the progressive movement. And what she said is that when she was very young, she learned a lesson from her mother. And what her mother taught her was this. Her mother said, "There are two kinds of people. The ones who say, someone ought to do something about it, but why should it be I? And then there are the ones who say, somebody must do something about it, then why not I?" And Alice Hamilton, she saw herself as that second kind of person. And Neenah's women progressives were very much of that ilk too. So first let's talk about the Tuesday Club. I've got a program from the 1906-1907 Women's Tuesday Club yearbook up here. And then this is the inside title page. Neenah's Women's Tuesday Club was founded in 1886. And the point of the organization is basically to study, to create study courses and then generate discussion. It was about learning new information. And among other things, they would have these annual themed programs. Is this still how it works? Do you have a themed program that goes through the year?
We don't have an annual theme.
Oh, okay. So they would have these themed programs, and they would meet in members' homes, and then they would talk about whatever the theme for the year was. Usually you'd have several individuals who would come prepared with something they would report on and then generate discussion. And the idea was, to cultivate knowledge, to understand the world better. 1904, they got their own room in the new Neenah Library, and they had a room in the basement for years up into the 1950s. They had their own room there. About 40 members generally through this progressive era. And their topics in these programs were very much in keeping with progressivism. The method is progressive. So what they're doing is they're researching problems, and then they're communicating about them and raising awareness, right? So taking these initial steps and tackling the problem of the industrial age. I love the motto too. I think that's a great motto, right? Study to be what you wish to seem. I love that. Is that still the motto now? Yeah, it's a great motto. I like that a lot. So don't fake it, right? Actually be it. One of the things that this Tuesday Club did is they brought guest speakers in. Probably the most notable guest speaker that they brought was in 1900, and her name was Jane Addams. And we've probably heard of her. She's the most notable woman progressive of the era. She's also from Chicago. Arguably the most notable progressive period. In a lot of ways, she personifies progressivism. Considered the mother of social work, essentially generated the profession. Won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931. So she's a heavy hitter. She first got involved in the progressive movement through Hull House. That's an outside picture of Hull House over there on the left. That's an inside picture over there on the right. Hull House was in Chicago. And what it was a settlement house. And in fact, settlement houses, the settlement house movement, this was the topic of what she talked about here in Neenah. She had raised the money to purchase an old mansion in Chicago. And it's a mansion that had been swallowed up by the city, by poor neighborhoods. And so she purchased this mansion, and then she and other women like her, college-educated women, moved in there and created a settlement house. And the idea was that they would do outreach to the community, to the immigrants, poor people, working class people living in the community. A lot of these women, like Jane Addams, were women who were well educated and who had even professional qualifications, but because there wasn't a lot of opportunity for women professionals at the time, they were kind of frustrated in establishing a career. So this was a creative outlet, a productive outlet, a way to use their knowledge and their training. And initially the idea was that they were just going to bring art and culture into these neighborhoods, that they lacked these cultural institutions and outlets. But then settlement houses and Hull House, certainly, they evolved into these institutions that responded to the needs of the community, dealt with social problems in the community. So one of the things that Hull House did was it provided childcare for working families, right? And so most working families in Chicago at the time, 2 working parents, and the kids stay home. Very often you would have, say, a 9-year-old daughter or son who would take care of the other kids all day. So the idea was we provide them actual adequate child care. Kindergartens, they would teach basic home economics skills. There were medical clinics there. And then they also took on this political role, settlement houses. And they do advocacy, legal and political advocacy for working people. Another thing they did was they conducted social surveys. So a lot of these women who worked in Hull House and other settlement houses, they were trained sociologists. And they would go out into the neighborhoods and they would just interview people and gather information about them, their national origins, their income, their occupation, their health, the housing conditions. So in fact, a lot of what we know about working class people in American cities at the turn of the century, a lot of it comes out of these studies. One of the big, I guess, mental changes that is going on with progressive women at Hull House and other settlement houses is the way that they started to think of poverty. And what women like Jane Addams believed is that poverty was caused by social and economic conditions, and that it was a social problem. And that's new. That's actually a new conception of poverty. Up until that time, most people in the United States think that poverty is a personal problem. And if you're poor, it's because you lack morality or ambition, or you're lazy, or you're drunk too often. And what other progressive women are saying is no. I mean, these are the conditions of society put certain people in these places. So what we can do is if we change the environment, if we improve the environment in which they live, then they'll go out and they'll improve themselves. One of the phrases that she uses is civic housekeeping. Right? This is like civic housekeeping. And so that women, because they have this unique role, right, and have been ascribed this unique role of caring, nurturing, fulfilling obligations, that they can do this for entire communities through settlement houses. And that's the talk that she gave that day about the settlement house movement, the significance of that movement. It's more than just providing a place for people to go. Some civic housekeeping that the Tuesday Club did. An example of that, in 1899, the Tuesday Club was instrumental in advocating for an expansion of the Neenah Library. At the time, it was housed in City Hall. And in 1899, they mounted this big push and a fundraising campaign to expand it, to make it bigger, to lengthen the hours that it operated, and then to put in a reading room. The Neenah Daily Times talked about this, and Times is quoted as saying, "For a piece of genuine public-spirited enterprise, that which the ladies of the Neenah Tuesday Club are now contemplating stands in front rank." Right, so he's commenting on this civic engagement and housekeeping that they're doing. This is from inside that Tuesday Club program. It's the list of officers. And there are probably some familiar names there, right? Mrs. Albert Gilbert, Mrs. William Gilbert. So again, these are wives of the owners and the operators of some of the big paper mills. And so this is where that book is wrong in that, I mean, these women are out there and they're engaged. The president is Mrs. Ann Gilbert. I had to look up her actual first name, Mrs. Albert Gilbert. I had to look up her actual first name, and it's Anne, right? Everybody uses their husband's name at the time. This is a photograph of her with her children. Her husband, Albert Gilbert, worked at Gilbert Paper. Mrs. William Gilbert is Priscilla Harstock Gilbert. She's the wife at that time of the current president of Gilbert Paper. Going further into this program, so this is that 1906-1907 program. Now we can see some of the topics that they were interested in, and they're fascinating, and we get the names of the people who are going to present on these topics. And so the theme this year was sociology, and what they studied was social problems, pauperism, its causes and reliefs, and that's a Miss Shattuck, right, another paper name. Mrs. William Gilbert, The Life of the Tramp. I like this one. Who is he? How is he made? What shall we do with him? I would love to have heard these, and apparently the Tuesday Club has records and they have minutes, and so we're wondering maybe if some of this might be in there in terms of what they actually talked about. If we look over here on the right, the waifs of the great city, and Miss Bonnie Kimball presented on that. And whoever had this program in their hand, they jotted some notes down there. And I look up here, and RISS, she was talking about Jacob Riis, right? So they're probably talking about that very photo that we were looking at when they were talking about the waifs of the city and the causes of juvenile crime. So you can see where these women are engaged in this national trend and this national movement that's going on. So that's a picture of Clara Bloom, and this is another page from that program, 1906-1907. Clara Bloom was part of a presentation on the problems of the family, and she presented on living and getting a living. Clara Bloom is interesting, and I actually like to know more about her, but Clara Bloom grew up in the area. She graduated from Menasha High. She graduated in 1896, and then went off to Ripon College, graduated Ripon College in 1904, and so she's actually one of the first generation, one of the women who are in that first generation of women who are college educated, who get a traditional college education as we think of it. So she's probably would have been in her mid-20s at this time when she was doing this presentation, and she was a working woman. So after graduating from Ripon College, she went and she worked at the Neenah Daily News. Her father was the publisher of the paper, and so at that time she was working at the Neenah Daily News. She would go on to be the editor. When her father died, she would take over the editorship. And then when the News merged with the Times, she became the editor of the News Times in 1919. So a successful career woman. And she's engaged in a number of these kinds of activities. So leaving the Tuesday Club, talk about the VNA. And the Visiting Nurse Association, this is an organization that's still around today. It's another progressive women's organization, and it was created during this period. It derived from actually the Emergency Aid Society. And in 1906, a number of Neenah women came together and they established the Emergency Aid Society. It was a response to the San Francisco earthquake, the disaster of the San Francisco earthquake, and they wanted to do something to come together and provide some sort of relief for the people of San Francisco, but then also to be there if there was any kind of disaster, a great Neenah earthquake or something, to have an emergency society in Neenah. And then very quickly they began advocating and then raising money for a visiting nurse. And as far back as 1906, they were doing this. Again, the Daily Times in 1906 was talking about a fundraising event that the Emergency Society was going to have. It's a fundraising event at the home of what the Times said was Mrs. J.A. Kimberly, and that's Helen Cheney Kimberly, the husband of John Alfred, and we've got a picture of the two of them there. I mean, I think it's particularly notable that the paper announced this as being at her house, right? Not his house, but her house. Said in every district the size of the combined Twin Cities, this is the Times speaking, it is almost necessary to have a visiting nurse. Most of the deaths among infants and many among adults are due to neglect. And then they had that meeting. Apparently it was very successful. The paper talked about it being a good meeting. They got quite liberal donations, and that the proceeds were going to go towards hiring a trained nurse to act in case of emergency, and especially for the sick and needy. So even beyond emergencies now, already it started to evolve into this outreach organization that's going to take care of needy people. The VNA itself was founded 2 years later in 1908. Ann Gilbert, who was the president of the Tuesday Club in 1906, 1907, she was the first president of the VNA. A number of the other women from that appear in that Tuesday Club program were also in this original VNA. So there's this core of active women. This picture over here on the right, that is the cover to a pamphlet that the VNA circulated in its early years. And a lot of what they did early on is they just tried to raise awareness of public health problems, of public health, of the existence of this VNA, and then also tried to raise money. And so this was the cover of a pamphlet in which they were doing all these things. And again, very progressive in terms of one of the intermediate steps towards solving a problem is making people aware of it and getting them engaged. The first employee to be hired to work for the VNA, pictured here, is Ida Heinecke. Really interesting woman. This is her medical bag that she used to carry around, and this bag, the Historical Society now has in their possession and will be an exhibit. Yeah, it's on loan from the VNA, and it will be in the exhibit that's upcoming. And much of that is still in there. And what we're looking at is a thermometer, some hypodermic needles, and then we were talking about this right here, which is no longer in there. This little vial. Does anybody know what that is? It would have been rubbing alcohol in there? I don't know. We actually don't know. It's not a rhetorical question. What the heck is that? What would have gone in there? And we don't know. It's a glass vial with a stopper. It looks like a cork stopper on top. But, yeah, I don't really know. Oh, actually, didn't we say that?
One possibility was maybe they had pills that they ground and made into a serum for injection.
Yeah, so probably serum, like some kind of liquid serum. So yeah, Ida Heinecke, she had graduated from nursing school in Oshkosh just before they hired her in 1908, and she's the first visiting nurse that they hired. She was paid $50 a month, $50 a month salary. She traveled by horse, so a visiting nurse would actually go out and visit people in the community. She's not stationed at a clinic. She goes out and visits. And she traveled by horse, and the story is that during the winter months, it was so cold that her horse couldn't take the cold when she was inside and it was just standing out there in the cold. So she stopped traveling by horse and started to walk. So the horse could not take it, but Ida could and continued to do this. Her very first month, I think it was October of 1908, she did 116 separate visits in that first month, and she'd do monthly reports. And that was typical. When you look at the reports that she files, they're usually up above 100 every month. People would pay according to their ability to pay. And a lot of the people that she visited were poorer people who didn't pay much, if anything at all. And so the VNA, Ida Heinecke, was part of a larger national trend. There was a national organization that was formed. It was formed in 1912 called the National Organization of Public Health Nurses. That's 4 years after Ida Heinecke was already working as a public nurse, and VNA ended up affiliating with that organization in 1917. So this is an area in terms of community and public health where Neenah was really out there on the leading edge, on the cutting edge of this new concept and a new profession. And there just weren't public nurses before this. There weren't school nurses, there weren't industrial nurses. And so for a lot of people, this is the first time that they had access really to any kind of trained medical care. The purpose of the organization, as the VNA stated, it was to promote health, individual health, family health, but then particularly community health. And so this is really about the health of the community, the public welfare, a very progressive way of thinking. The purpose of the organization was to prevent disease, and mainly to do that through education and instruction, in sanitation and in hygiene. And then finally, the purpose of the organization was this direct outreach, nursing care to the sick and others in need. You look at the diseases and the illnesses that she was dealing with, and some of them we're familiar with and are still around, pneumonia. Some of them were around when I was a kid and when most of you were kids, but now have basically been eradicated, like measles and mumps. And then there's those other diseases that, had never been around in my lifetime in any substantial way, like smallpox and whooping cough, polio, diphtheria, people are dealing with. A lot of tuberculosis cases, And then the other thing, a lot of maternity cases. She delivered gave a lot of obstetric care and delivered a lot of babies. For women who may have had access to a midwife, may not have before. So it's a lot of what she did. So she's walking around, and I would imagine still using the horse and buggy at times, right? I doubt that she walked everywhere. But in 1917, she got a car. And this is a picture of Ida Heinecke here posing in front of her new Ford Coupe in 1917. She's got her medical bag there. You can see she's holding it. She's got her driving gloves on, too. Those are some pretty substantial driving gloves that she's got. On the left, that's the registration for that Ford Coupe. It's the second year. And this is in the records of the VNA. Did the VNA give these to you, or are they at the Neenah Historical Society?
They're on loan.
Okay, so they're on loan from the VNA, and they still have the original auto registration from the state of Wisconsin. And so this is a car, a Ford Coupe, that's registered to the Visiting Nurse Association of Neenah, Wisconsin. It's a great picture, proudly posing in front of that car. Taught herself to drive. And she taught herself to drive so that she could see more patients and do better outreach. So we've talked about the Tuesday Club, talked about the VNA. Last organization that I want to talk about is the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And there was a WCTU chapter in Neenah. That chapter was founded in 1885. There was also a Winnebago County region, and the Neenah chapter was part of that region. Clara Bloom, the journalist, she was actually active in that WCTU. She attended the county convention in 1913. And this was a temperance organization, right? So this is an organization that worked to eradicate alcohol consumption and sales and distribution. But it was also bigger than that. And it had broader progressive goals, the WCTU. The national organization, WCTU, was first founded in 1874, so not long before the Neenah chapter. This woman here is Frances Willard. She's not from Neenah. She was a founding member of the WCTU, but not the first president. But she became president, she took over in 1879. And she really put her stamp on this organization. Before she became president, it was an organization that relied on what's called moral suasion. So their method of trying to eradicate alcohol abuse was basically to target individuals and to meet and talk to individuals directly and try to persuade them that what they were doing was morally wrong. And the thinking was that alcoholism, alcohol abuse, this is an individual moral problem, right? And that's how we're to solve it. And when Willard took over, their methods really changed when Frances Willard took over. Her motto, this is a great motto, and it's the motto she had for the WCTU, was do everything. Do everything. And so what she's talking about is, let's not just focus on individuals who have moral failings, as we see it. Do everything. And so she advocated lobbying to get laws passed that would eradicate alcohol abuse, petitioning, publishing, public speaking, scientific education about the dangers of alcohol in schools. So do everything, all of these other things. And it's because she sees alcoholism as a social problem, right? It's a societal problem. It's not just an individual problem. The Winnebago County WCTU in 1913 collected 300 essays that had been written by middle schoolers in a contest where they were talking about alcohol in the human body. So they offered this prize money to kids, write an essay, best one wins the prize money. And that's very typical of the WCTU. This is a headline from a Minnesota newspaper where they had done the same thing. They did this in the 1920s. And so this is a typical method. That's that scientific education about alcohol. They saw alcohol abuse as a societal problem and also as a woman's rights issue. The WCTU treated it as such. And so it was about protecting women who were oftentimes the victims of abuse, either from alcoholic partners or abandonment, crime victims, forced into prostitution. And so it was part of a much wider reform program as Willard saw it, the temperance movement. And she advocated laws for age of sexual consent, anti-prostitution laws, labor reform, especially reforms that would protect women workers in particular. Her influence was particularly strong in these Midwestern chapters of the WCTU, and you can see it in the Neenah chapter and in the Winnebago chapters. She also advocated women's suffrage. And what she said is the way to do this, right, if we really want to get laws passed, what we need women voters who are going to vote for prohibition laws. The Winnebago County WCTU passed a resolution at their convention in 1916. And what they said was, quote, believing that mothers can be trusted not to betray their children at the ballot box, and that prohibition will be sooner attained by the cooperation of the sexes, we do reconsecrate our best efforts and redouble our zeal for equal suffrage. So in this area of the state, in Wisconsin and Winnebago County, the WCTU was a suffrage organization too. They were advocating for voting rights for women. And then they had some success in terms of temperance in Neenah. And so on July the 1st, 1917, Neenah passed a no license referendum, voters in Neenah, which meant no license to sell or to serve alcohol. And so Neenah became a dry town in 1917, passed by one vote, once they had counted and recounted, one vote. So if you ever think, your vote doesn't matter, right? That's a case where that one vote made a big difference. That's 2.5 years before the 18th Amendment, right? So it's part of a larger national trend, and in fact precedes the national amendment for prohibition. And so I want to wrap up, and I want to bring it back to where we started. And so I want to again repeat that quotation from that book by Glob and Larson. And what they argued is that few members of the leadership seemed to be fundamentally concerned with shaping the character of the community in which they lived. They did not take the lead in promoting the growth and well-being of Neenah Menasha. And the problem is that those authors were looking at the wrong people, right? And they weren't looking at the women of, well-to-do women, like Helen Kimberly and Gilbert, middle-class women like Clara Bloom, Ida Heinecke. And these are people that shaped the character of their community. These are women that took the lead in promoting well-being. And these are women ultimately that made Neenah a hometown, and the hometown that you live in today. Thank you very much. If you had questions or comments or wanted to share, I would be happy to open up the floor.
This article that they wrote about, I forgot what that guy's name was.
Question.
Just a second. We've got a question here, and then I'll
I forgot what that guy's name was that he's writing about
the book. So
was he selling it to the general public?
The book about Neenah that was kind of critical of the passiveness. It's an academic book. It was actually published through the Wisconsin Historical Society.
Sold to the general public. Essentially.
It was. It was available to the public. It's 1969. It's on the library shelves. I think they have a couple of copies here, and so yeah, I mean it's a book that's available. I don't think it was a bestseller. I don't think it was ever meant to be. But I think it was something that, as a project, it came from a larger project that the Historical Society was doing at the time, where they were bringing people in to write lots of local histories of areas around the state. And so I think the idea was it might be attractive to people living in the state, particularly people living in the Fox Cities region. Yeah, and if you're interested, it's called Factories in the Valley, and it's out there. So.
I found a copy of it a couple weeks ago at a thrift rummage sale.
you've got a copy at a rummage sale. Did you buy it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
It was at a church rummage sale a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, and I think it's still in print. You could certainly come across copies of it.
On that major talk that the Tuesday Club had, the seminar, it had all subjects. One subject was, how do we keep the farm boys from coming to the city? I've never heard of that as a problem.
That was pretty
Way over the number 3 over on the right.
There, number 3.
The boy in the farm, how can he be kept from the city?
Oh, my goodness.
My suspicion is that what we're talking about is that the city is, the location of concentrated vice and corruption, and it's where boys go to get in trouble. And so boys would probably be better off not being there and being back on the farm in the open air doing good, honest work, rather than drinking, gambling, and getting involved in organized crime. Yeah, how can he be kept from the city?
Well, I read a couple years back about Helen Cheney Kimberly.
Uh-huh.
She endowed a professor at a college in Milwaukee, and the field of study was home economics.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was so cool. Milwaukee Downer College, which became part of Lawrence. And she wanted to make sure that women knew what home economics was all about.
And home economics is very much a product of this
Yeah.
progressive era and this reform
How
movement.
to keep your food safe, how to keep your home healthy.
How to operate more efficiently, and a lot of it was directed, again, at immigrant women, working women who might not know these things, or the perception was they might not know these things. I didn't know that, so she endowed a chair of home economics.
Yeah, a downer.
Yeah, and then there was the home economics school in town. I'm drawing a blank on the name,
Yeah.
right? What was the name of, there was a,
It was the School of Home Economics.
it was just called the School of Home Economics. Yeah, in town. And then they
She led it.
they eventually brought it into the high schools too, and Helen Cheney Kimberly led that School of Home Economics.
What's the significance of the Tuesday, class?
Oh, they met on Tuesdays.
That was just.
Yeah, they met weekly on Tuesday. Do you still meet on Tuesday? We do. Okay. Thus the Women's Tuesday Club. It's women and they meet on Tuesday. Yeah, I should have said that.
Monday was wash day.
Monday was wash day. Okay, so you get the wash done, then you go out and learn something on Tuesday.
There was a Wednesday club formed in Appleton, same format, that still operates in the same format, yearly theme.
Okay.
Very serious business.
So-
It was formed right about the same time. I think it might have been a year before this.
Wednesday Appleton Club, and that's also still
Yes, but
up
it's
and running?
very serious business.
okay.
Good.
Are you from Appleton?
No.
Okay, good. We don't like them here. Other questions or things we wanted to share? Yeah.
I'm serious about this.
Okay.
You have a great database now of how women can improve a community. From your background, what now might be the things that be attacked today in communities by the force like it was done 100 years ago?
Wow. So what would, if there were a progressive movement now, what would they do? I'll turn it over.
I'm just going to say one thing. Our opening program for Tuesday Club next fall is going to be on human trafficking.
There we go. Same issue, right? We call it human trafficking. They would have called white slavery back at the time period.
Certainly drug use too.
Yeah.
Drug use is the other one that pops into my mind. I saw a hand go up back here.
And that's what I was going to say too, that some years back we had a committee, Neenah Community Action Committee, that was trying to encourage young people into different activities. I don't know what happened to it.
Yeah, and so those are the two that I would think of off the top of my head in terms of targeting unhealthy behaviors and elements in the community.
Kind of in rebuttal about, not you, but that crazy book.
It's not a crazy book. It's actually a good book, but the way I present it to you, it's...
Well, when you think of the people who founded Neenah, the movers and shakers back then, their primary job was to create jobs, to grow business. They're not really primarily running around thinking of what little thing can I do today. They've got giant corporations that these people are starting. Now, my family was the direct beneficiary of one of the Kimberleys. Grandpa died in 1925. Grandma had no money. Kids were still in school. This Mr. Kimberley opened up a restaurant called the Sign of the Fox, giving my grandmother and her sister the running of that particular restaurant. So I think it's remarkable if any of them had any time to think about this sort of stuff.
There was a
I
lot
mean,
of,
in all honesty, their wives were virtually women of leisure. They didn't really. Hey, my grandma started out working for the Kimberleys when she was about 7 years of age as a helper in the kitchen. These wives had education, they had breeding, they had intelligence, and they had time, and they had the desire to do something for their communities. I think it's remarkable that they did, but I really think it's wrong for whatever that author was to give the idea that, gee, these men really didn't do a whole hell of a lot.
they had the money.
And I agree with you, and it's why I put that in there, and it's kind of an attention grabber. I don't want to go and grab the torches and pitchforks and track the author down or anything. And it is a balanced book otherwise, but I think Jane has been the driving force behind the exhibit that's going up, and what you're talking about really speaks to that exhibit, which is to make a hometown, you need an economy, you need jobs, but then you need something more. And really that's what this exhibit is about, is how the two work hand in hand, community builders, job creators, industry. And that's what makes,
Well, something else that these industrialists did was create a basis of wealth so that these other things could be done. And they gave, my impression is, they gave their wives, sisters, daughters the luxury and the say-so, go and do that. And the other thing they did was that they underwrote churches.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a member of a church that received 2 wonderful endowments from Kimberleys,
Mm-hmm.
and they were doing that for the future.
Mm-hmm.
In mitigation to the poor industrialists who've been chewed on tonight, the 4 founders of Kimberly-Clark was a book, one of the first histories of the company, called 4 Men and a Machine. And in there they listed 4 things, and I haven't read it for a long time, but one of them was to give a fair wage to our workers. The other thing was that Mr. Shattuck, one of the 4 founders, he put his son in charge of employee safety, out of which grew the National Safety Council.
Mm-hmm.
So they were also paying attention too.
Mm-hmm.
The point that your author that you quoted made at the end was that these men were giving to charity. They were philanthropic to organizations outside of the area.
Mm-hmm. That's one of the things that they argue. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Not that they didn't care at all.
Yeah, and I think that they did some things for the community, but they weren't as actively engaged as they could be or maybe should be, I guess, as authors.
These people were philanthropists, but they were humble, and that book was written out of state stats, and the newspaper. And if their stuff didn't make the newspaper, it didn't make the book.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's very.
They missed
the
whole
statistical.
picture.
Statistical, and they missed.
I agree, they missed a lot. Right.
Well, now I've had 2 chances to hear the dates of the Progressive era, and what did you say? When did it start?
So it's. I date it to around 1885, 1890 or so.
Oh, okay.
And then
Then
it
I'm
goes
not gonna-
up through World War I.
Okay, then I'm not going to bring that up about the girdles, because that was a little bit before that. That was
Okay.
around the 1850s that those were disappearing. But another thing that I like to remind us of, I guess, is that speaking about Kimberly-Clark, is the taboo subject of women and menstruation, the thing that really did get them started were pads, women's pads, in about the 1923, 1924. And interestingly, Johnson & Johnson tried to do this in the late 1890s, and they couldn't pull it off. They had a pad, but they couldn't pull this women buying it. But what Kimberly Clark did is they had this hotshot marketer, and all of you that are in marketing know how important marketing is to get the product to move. And I can't remember the man's name, unfortunately, but it's in that book, that hardbound book that they published, I believe in the 50s. And it says who it was, and he pushed that thing. It was a he that pushed that, and he got it going. And you know, it's the rest is history. They eventually made the tampon, but that didn't take off very well either at first, even Kimberly Clark's. But it eventually did, as we all know. But there was one other thing. Oh, and then my husband reminded me just tonight why what started the pads were nurses in World War I, and they were stealing the bandages, and what do you call it? Is it cellulose or
Cellucotton.
Cellucotton. And they were grabbing that for their monthly periods. And from that, then Kimberly Clark started. I just think it's fascinating. And the only reason I know that stuff is I used to teach women's health at the University of Oshkosh. So that was part of it.
Well, along those same lines, my dad worked for KC, and I'm from a very large family, and my mother sent a letter to KC asking them why don't they make disposable diapers. She got a letter back saying because it's not a wise investment. And then they came out with, years later, they came out with the Kimbies, and then the Kimbies switched over. I don't know which brand now is.
Huggies.
Huggies. Huggies. Okay. Yeah, because I like the name Kimbies. I thought that was so cool, for Kimberly Clark. Yeah.
And now it's cheaper to do disposable diapers than it is to have a washing machine to do the laundry diapers.
I think we had another comment or question in the back.
In regards to the comment the lady made earlier, in the 1920s, KC was trying to sell these tampons and was very unsuccessful in doing it because they had these men selling it, of course, no clue what they're doing. And they actually hired a woman to do it. And this woman, who is an educated woman, goes out east and hits Eastern colleges and starts hitting these educated women to how this product works, and then take it home. Take it home to your daughters and teach your daughters how to use this thing. And that's what really kicked it off in the 1920s, where they're looking at New England women who are educated women who are going to spread this knowledge to other young women out there in American society. And there was an article several years ago in the News Record about this woman who did this for KC, and I can't think of her name, it escapes me. Jane, do you know who it is? This KC lady, or she's like the Kotex lady or something?
I know what you're talking about. Yeah, I don't know her name either. It looks like we're kind of filing out, so I think I'll wrap it up here. I'll stick around for a little bit. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your enthusiasm.
We appreciate it.
Another wonderful